The transmission arrived at 3:47 Greenwich Mean Time on a Tuesday because the universe, it turned out, had no respect for business hours. Every screen on Earth flickered simultaneously. Every radio frequency, every television channel, every military communication band went dead for exactly 4 seconds, and then the signal replaced everything. It was not a request. It was not a greeting. It was a declaration, translated into every human language with a precision that suggested the sender had been listening for a very long time. By order of the Galactic Conclave, the planetary body designated Earth, Sol System, Sector 7 Gamma, is hereby selected as the official arena for the right of territorial claim between the Vreth Dominion and the Kale Ascendancy. Civilian population is advised to begin voluntary evacuation procedures within 72 standard hours. Noncompliance will result in incidental casualties for which the Conclave assumes no liability. The right will commence upon the expiration of the allotted period. That was it. No signature beyond the Conclave seal, no contact frequency for questions, no appeal process. In the United Earth Council chamber in Geneva, the silence afterward lasted 11 seconds. 11 full seconds where 47 of the most powerful human beings on the planet simply stared at the translated text floating above the central display. The Conclave's envoy, a tall, gray-skinned creature called a Velhari, with 4 eyes arranged vertically and a mouth that moved slightly out of sync with its translated voice, stood at the podium with the patient stillness of someone who had done this before. Many times. It held the posture of a bureaucrat delivering a parking violation. Several counselors had gone pale. One was quietly having what appeared to be a panic attack. The Secretary General of Earth's Unified Defense Council, a former Nigerian general named Yusuf Tariq, had his hands folded on the table in front of him, his expression unreadable. But it was Ambassador Sarah Malone who made history in that room, not with words, not yet, but with a single expression. She smiled. Not the polite, diplomatic smile of someone trying to project calm in a crisis. Not the forced smile of someone managing their fear. It was a slow, quiet, deeply private smile. The kind a person wears when something they have been told their whole life, something they had always believed but could never quite prove, is finally confirmed true. The Velhari envoy noticed. Its 4 eyes settled on her, and for the first time in the proceedings, something shifted in its posture, a barely perceptible recalibration. "Ambassador," it said carefully, "do you require a moment to process the declaration?" Malone looked up at it. The smile was still there. "No," she said, "I'm fine, please proceed." The envoy proceeded. It outlined the Conclave's standard provisions for battleground worlds, a framework established 4,000 years ago, used approximately 600 times across the known galaxy. It explained that the Vreth Dominion and the Kale Ascendancy were both Tier 1 galactic powers engaged in a centuries-old territorial dispute over a resource-rich star cluster in the Outer Arm. Earth had been selected due to its geographic position, its low strategic value to the broader conclave, and what the official assessment described as its pre-emergent civilizational status. A polite way of saying humanity was considered too primitive to be worth consulting. The envoy finished. It looked around the chamber at the pale faces, the trembling hands, the barely contained horror. Then it looked at Malone again. She was taking notes. Not recordings, not digital transcriptions. Handwritten notes in a small leather notebook with a pen. The envoy processed this for nearly 2 seconds, found no framework for interpreting it, and concluded it was likely a primitive coping ritual. It would not discover how wrong it was for another 68 hours. Outside the chamber, in a secure subbasement 14 floors below street level, a single encrypted signal went out on a frequency that appeared in no conclave database, no alien intelligence file, no intercepted human communication ever cataloged by any species watching Earth. It was 40 characters long. It had been pre-written for decades, waiting in a dead-drop system for exactly this moment. The signal read, Hearthstone acknowledged, Vigil CONFIRMS, begin Phase 1. In bunkers beneath 6 continents, in facilities hidden under mountains and sea floors, in chambers built quietly over 300 years by people who had long since turned to dust, lights came on. Earth had received its invitation. Earth had been waiting for it. The year was 1752, and a man named Edmund Cray was dying. He was not famous. History would not remember him. He had no great inventions, no military victories, no political legacy. He was a mathematician, an amateur astronomer, and a deeply, profoundly frightened human being because Edmund Cray had done the math. He had calculated the age of the visible universe. He had estimated the number of stars. He had worked through the probabilities of life emerging around those stars, of that life developing intelligence, of that intelligence developing technology. The numbers were conservative, careful, triple-checked, and they produced only one conclusion: the galaxy was full. Humanity was not unique. And given the gap between the oldest possible civilizations and the newest, the relationship between Earth and whatever was already out. There was not going to be a relationship between equals. It was going to be a relationship between prey and predator. Before he died, Cray wrote a single letter and sent it to 11 people: scientists, philosophers, a retired admiral, a Jesuit astronomer, and a Prussian clockmaker whose hobby was mechanical computation. The letter was 40 pages long. It was also, in the judgment of everyone who read it, completely correct. The Vigil was founded in a tavern in Edinburgh in the autumn of 1753 by 8 people sitting around a fire. They had no funding, no government backing, and no certainty that they would ever be believed by anyone outside their small circle. What they had was the math, the letter, and the bone-deep conviction that humanity's survival would never come from hoping the universe was kind. It would come from being ready. Over the next 3 centuries, the Vigil grew. Slowly, carefully, invisibly. It recruited inside universities, military establishments, engineering firms, and government agencies. It never held press conferences. It never published papers. Every member signed an oath that they understood would outlast their own life, because the Vigil's mission was not a project. It was a civilization-level commitment that would span generations. They began with intelligence. If something was out there, the Vigil needed to understand it before it arrived. By the mid-1800s, Vigil-aligned astronomers had developed signal detection methods a century ahead of anything in the public scientific record. By 1901, they had intercepted fragments of conclave band transmissions, unintelligible but unmistakably structured, unmistakably artificial. By 1947, they knew they were watching not one civilization but dozens. By 1969, while the world watched humans walk on the moon, Vigil analysts were translating their 4th alien language. They also built, not weapons first, information architecture first. Secure communication networks buried beneath national grid infrastructure, hidden in plain sight as redundant power routing. Then materials research, conducted inside legitimate industrial facilities, producing alloys and composites that appeared in no academic journal because the Vigil had its own supply chains, its own fabrication plants, its own quality controls. By the 1920s, they were laying what they called the lattice, a system of energy-conducting filaments woven into the geology of every populated continent, deeper than any mine, anchored to tectonic bedrock, designed to absorb and redirect incoming kinetic and energy-based impacts on a planetary scale. It took 40 years to complete. The public space programs, Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, the ISS, every Mars mission, every satellite constellation, were real. Humanity genuinely wanted to explore space. The Vigil simply ensured that every program also served a second function. Satellites carried sensor arrays tuned to conclave frequencies. Moon installations had lower levels. The Mars base had an emergency fabrication facility, capable of producing military-grade hardware in the event of a worst-case scenario on Earth. The Vigil called this philosophy the second floor. Everything humanity built officially was the first floor. The second floor was always there, always deeper, always for the scenario nobody wanted to admit was coming. By 2150, the vigil had recruited nearly 4 million people across every nation. By 2200, that number was 12 million soldiers, engineers, scientists, logistics specialists, medical staff, all living ordinary lives, all holding a secondary identity and a secondary assignment that would activate only when the signal came. They had families. They had mortgages. They coached youth football and complained about traffic and grew old. And they waited. Edmund Cray had written in his letter, "We will not have centuries to prepare once they arrive. We must prepare during the centuries before they do. Every generation that builds the wall makes the next generation safer. The debt we owe our descendants is not wealth or empire, it is time. Buy them time. Build them walls. Give them a fighting chance at a future we will never see." On the night the conclave transmission landed, in a small museum in Edinburgh, not a famous museum, an unremarkable one the kind tourists walk past, there was a painting. No plaque, no attribution, just a man sitting at a desk by a fire, writing, with a look on his face that was equal parts terror and absolute determination. The museum closed quietly that night, as it did every night. The man in the painting had been right about everything. Hour 1. The cameras were everywhere. Every news network on Earth had drones in the air over Geneva before the conclave envoy had even left the building. The footage of the Velhari, tall, gray, four-eyed, moving with a fluid, unsettling grace, was already the most watched video in human history before it reached the lobby doors. Social media was a catastrophe of panic, conspiracy theories, religious declarations, and one surprisingly calm Reddit thread, where an aerospace engineer was methodically explaining why 72 hours was probably not enough time to evacuate 8 billion people, and the conclave likely knew that when they set the deadline. The engineer was right, the conclave knew. They had expected compliance, or collapse, or both. Secretary General Tariq addressed the world at 600. He was calm, measured, and precise. He acknowledged the declaration. He announced that Earth was taking the evacuation provision under serious consideration. He asked for patience, for unity, and for people to stay in their homes and away from transport hubs while the United Earth Council coordinated a response. He did not mention Hearthstone. He did not mention the vigil. He looked directly into the camera and said, with the quiet confidence of a man who had spent his entire adult life preparing for exactly this moment, "Earth is not without options." The conclave's monitoring satellites, positioned in geosynchronous orbit above every continent, placed there 17 years ago as standard procedure once Earth hit first contact protocols, recorded the broadcast, and flagged the phrase for analysis. The flag came back as likely propaganda, intended to prevent mass civilian panic. The conclave analysts marked it irrelevant and moved on. In the background of the feed, barely visible behind Tariq's right shoulder, Malone was reading from her small leather notebook. Hour 6. The evacuation ships launched. They were genuine, real ships, carrying real people. The vigil had planned for this too. 40 million civilians, mostly children, elderly, medical-dependent individuals, boarded vessels that had been pre-positioned in orbital staging areas for a decade under the official designation of Emergency Planetary Evacuation Infrastructure, a program the United Nations had funded without fully understanding what it was really for. The ships rose in long, slow columns from every major spaceport on Earth, visible from the ground as glittering threads of light against the morning sky. The conclave satellites watched the launches. Their analysis teams counted the ships, estimated the capacity, and began projecting an evacuation completion timeline. They noted that at the current rate, approximately 1.2% of Earth's population would be off-planet by the end of the 72-hour window. They flagged this as expected for pre-emergent civilizations and noted that residual civilian casualties during the rite were within acceptable conclave parameters. They did not notice what the ships were not carrying. They were not carrying soldiers. They were not carrying engineers. They were not carrying any of the 12 million vigilactive personnel who had, in the past 6 hours, quietly left their homes, kissed their families, and reported to their secondary assignments. Hour 12. Below the Atacama Desert, a chamber the size of a city came online. Below the Siberian Plateau, fabrication systems that had been in cold standby for 11 years began running at full capacity, producing components for weapons platforms that existed in no public military database anywhere on Earth. Below the Indian Ocean, between tectonic plates, the lattice ran a full-power diagnostic for the first time in its operational existence. It drew so much energy that power grids in 3 coastal nations experienced brief fluctuations. The conclave satellites noted the fluctuations and classified them as infrastructure stress from the evacuation's energy demands. Correct conclusion. Catastrophically wrong reason. Hour 24. Malone requested a formal communication channel with the conclave envoy. She asked, very politely, for clarification on one technical point in the Wright Declaration. Specifically, whether the framework allowed for a designated battleground world to formally object to its selection on grounds of territorial sovereignty under Conclave Charter Article 9. The envoy took 4 hours to respond. When it did, it confirmed that Article 9 did technically allow such an objection, but noted that Article 9 had been invoked by a designated world exactly once in 4,000 years, and that the world in question had been a Tier 3 civilization with standing conclave membership, neither of which applied to Earth. Malone thanked it for the clarification. She wrote something in her notebook. Hour 48. The Vreth Dominion's forward fleet dropped out of faster-than-light transit at the edge of the Sol system. 47 warships, each one larger than Manhattan Island. They moved in formation toward Earth with the slow, deliberate confidence of something that had never once been afraid of where it was going. Their long-range sensors swept the planet. They noted the evacuation ships in orbit. They noted the standard infrastructure signatures of a pre-emergent world. They noted no military assets of significant threat profile. On the bridge of the Vreth flagship, a commander named Vethorin reviewed the Earth assessment file. It was thin, 4 pages. Most of it was a description of humanity's publicly known space program and a note that the species had not yet achieved faster-than-light travel. Vethorin set the file down and ordered the fleet to battle formation. Hour 71. General Tarek sat alone in the deepest operational level of Hearthstone's Central Command, 30 meters below the Swiss Alps, and looked at a display showing the position of every activated vigil unit on Earth. 412,000 military positions, 11,000 weapons installations, 6 planetary lattice anchor points, all green, orbital defense platforms hidden in the debris fields of 3 near-Earth asteroids, powered up and waiting. He thought about Edmund Cray. He thought about all the generations between then and now. All the people who had built this and never seen it used, who had sworn oaths and kept them and gone to their graves not knowing if it had all been worth it. Tarek picked up the command key. He thought, we're about to find out. Hour 72. The countdown reached 0. The Vreth fleet fired. It was not hasty or emotional. It was procedural. The standard orbital suppression phase of any right engagement, designed not to destroy the battleground world but to soften it, to clear surface infrastructure, collapse defensive positions, and ensure that when troops landed they were walking into a stunned, broken environment rather than an organized one. 47 warships opened fire simultaneously. From orbit, the strike was beautiful in the terrible way that only very large, very precise acts of destruction can be. Columns of directed energy descended through the atmosphere in perfect geometric formations, targeting the coordinates the Conclave's intelligence had flagged as Earth's highest density military and industrial zones. Cities, ports, power infrastructure, transportation hubs. Below each of those coordinates, the lattice waited. The first strikes hit like hammers on a drumhead and the energy went sideways. Not absorbed exactly, redistributed. The lattice caught each impact at the point of entry, shunted the energy load horizontally through the filament network at speeds that made the redistribution effectively instantaneous, and dissipated it across thousands of square kilometers of unpopulated tectonic bedrock. The surface above each strike point shuddered, windows cracked, seismographs jumped, but the building stood. The craters the Vreth had expected simply did not appear. Vethorin stared at the post-strike survey results for a long time. "Run the diagnostic again," he said. The diagnostic confirmed weapons function was nominal. The strike coordinates were confirmed accurate. The target planet had simply not behaved the way target planets behaved. He ordered a second wave, doubled intensity, concentrated on a smaller area, the Geneva Basin, which intelligence had flagged as the location of Earth's primary governmental center. The second wave hit. The lattice handled it more efficiently than the first, because the first wave had finished warming the filament network to operational temperature. The redistribution was cleaner. The energy dissipated faster. The Geneva Basin experienced a magnitude 3.4 tremor and a brief power outage lasting 11 seconds. Inside the United Earth Council chamber, evacuated now, operating staff moved to secure underground facilities. The lights flickered, came back on, and the automated systems continued running without interruption. Vethorin looked at his weapons officer. The weapons officer had no explanation. In 400 years of right engagements, across 63 designated battleground worlds, orbital suppression had never, not once, produced this result. Then the communication came through. Single channel, originating from the surface, authenticated as a military command frequency, which itself was startling, because pre-emergent worlds were not supposed to have military command frequencies the Vreth could receive, which meant Earth had been listening to Vreth communication protocols long enough to reverse engineer them. The message was 12 words, delivered in flawless Vreth standard, the syntax perfect, the pronunciation carrying the precise formal register of a senior military commander addressing an inferior force. "You have warmed us up, thank you. We are ready when you are." Silence on the bridge of the Vreth flagship. Vethorin's secondary commander, a veteran officer named Sathvel who had personally participated in 9 previous right engagements, turned to look at him with an expression that was the Vreth equivalent of deeply unsettled. "Translation error?" she asked. "Run it again," Vethorin said. The translation system ran it again. The same 12 words came back, in the same register, with no ambiguity flags. The translation system added a cultural confidence notation. Source speaker demonstrates significant familiarity with formal Vreth military communication conventions. Probability of translation error, 0.3%. Vethorin ordered a third wave. He was not afraid. Vreth commanders did not become afraid. But he was, and he would never have used this word himself, curious, in an uncomfortable way. In the way a large, apex predator that has never been surprised in its life might become curious when something it expected to crush turns around and makes eye contact. The third wave hit. The lattice, now fully operational and running at optimal temperature, handled it with an almost contemptuous ease. Seismographic readings across the globe barely registered. At this point, the Kale Ascendancy Fleet, positioned in the outer system, observing the right opening phase as was standard conclave procedure, began quietly updating files. Their chief intelligence analyst, a meticulous creature named Isfaroth, pulled up Earth's pre-emergent assessment and stared at it for a very long time. Then she opened a new file and began a fresh assessment from scratch. On Earth's surface, in a valley in northern Norway where no roads appeared on any public map, a row of what looked from orbit like ordinary mountain ridgelines began to move. Slowly, then faster, the rock faces split open along pre-cut seams, and enormous armored doors swung outward on hydraulic hinges that had been maintained by vigil engineers once a year, every year, for 60 years. Inside, fighter craft, hundreds of them, designs that had never appeared in a public aviation exhibition, never been photographed, never been leaked, because the engineers who built them had understood that secrecy was its own kind of armor. They were ready to fly. Vethorin ordered the landing fleet to begin descent. He had no idea he was not the predator in this encounter anymore. 30 million Vreth soldiers descended through Earth's atmosphere in landing craft, so large they blotted out regional weather systems as they passed through the cloud layer. The landings were coordinated across 6 continents, deliberate, strategic, designed to fracture any coherent defensive response by forcing Earth's military to split its attention across hemispheres simultaneously. It was a perfect strategy for a world that hadn't been preparing for it for 300 years. The first Vreth ground force landed in the plains of Central Asia, approximately 60 kilometers east of what public maps showed as an agricultural region. 18,000 soldiers in full combat exoskeleton, supported by armored ground vehicles that could absorb direct hits from conventional munitions without slowing. They formed up in standard right assault formation and advanced toward the nearest population center. They made it 4 kilometers before the ground opened up. Not explosively, not in the catastrophic spray-in crater fashion of a mine or a buried charge. Precisely, methodically, panels in the soil surface, indistinguishable from the surrounding terrain until the moment they retracted, slid back along hidden rails, and from below rose a line of automated defense platforms that had been sitting in climate-controlled standby chambers since before any living soldier in either army had been born. The platforms opened fire with weapons the Vreth had never catalogued, firing projectiles that moved too fast for the naked eye, hitting with kinetic energy that the Vreth exoskeletons, rated to withstand direct conventional artillery impact, were not rated to absorb. The Vreth forward column stopped, pulled back, regrouped, called for air support. The air support arrived. Vreth atmospheric fighters descended, and from 3 separate mountain ranges surrounding the engagement zone, human-piloted fighter craft rose to meet them. Aircraft with no publicly known designation, no identification markings, flying with a tactical precision that suggested their pilots had been training in combat simulators for decades, running scenarios built from intercepted Vreth tactical data, studying Vreth formation doctrine, Vreth fighter response patterns, Vreth communication protocols. The Vreth Air Support Wing lost 40% of its craft in 11 minutes. This was not supposed to happen. The Vreth were Tier 1. They had been fighting wars across the galaxy for centuries. Their soldiers were trained, equipped, and experienced, but they were trained for enemies who used the tactics listed in the Conclave's Galactic Weapons Index. They were equipped against threat profiles their intelligence services had cataloged. They were experienced against civilizations that fought the way civilizations were expected to fight. Humanity had spent 300 years studying exactly how civilizations were expected to fight, specifically so it could do something different. Across the other 5 continents, the pattern repeated with variations. In South America, Vreth landing forces advanced into what appeared to be a dense tropical interior and discovered that the forest had been quietly threaded over 30 years, with a network of concealed defensive positions using the terrain itself as both cover and weapon. In North Africa, what the Vreth had assessed as a low-priority landing zone turned out to be the center of the most heavily fortified region on the planet, because the Vigil had deliberately made it look low priority. In East Asia, an entire armored Vreth division advanced 8 kilometers into what appeared to be an open corridor, and realized too late that the corridor was a designed kill zone 300 years in the making. By hour 6 of the ground engagement, the Vreth had suffered casualties at a rate their strategic models had not projected as possible against a pre-emergent world. By hour 12, their 3 most experienced ground commanders had submitted independent assessments to Vethorin recommending a tactical withdrawal to reestablish intelligence clarity. By hour 18, the Vreth were holding defensive positions on every continent, having advanced less than 20 kilometers in any direction. From the outer system, The Kale ascendancy was no longer passively observing. Isfaroth had been awake for 36 hours. Her new Earth assessment file was now 400 pages long and growing. She had pulled every intercepted human communication her fleet had ever collected going back decades, and she was running it backward, looking for the moment humanity had stopped being prey and started being something else. She couldn't find the moment. It had not been a moment, it had been centuries. She sent an encrypted message to Kale High Command. The message was brief, and the Kale communications officer who received it assumed there had been a transmission error, because the message, coming from one of the fleet's most experienced intelligence analysts, simply read, "Do not land, do not engage, I need 3 more days." General Tarek in the Hearthstone Command Center was watching 6 continental engagement feeds simultaneously on a display wall that covered an entire side of the chamber. He had not slept. He did not look like a man who needed to sleep. He looked like a man who had been carrying something enormously heavy for a very long time and had finally been allowed to set it down. His aide, a young colonel named Priya Anand who had been vigilactive since the age of 19, came to stand beside him. "They're not breaking through anywhere," she said. "They weren't going to," Tarek said. "They're regrouping in orbit. Could be a second strike package." "Let them try," Tarek said. He looked at the lattice status indicator on the lower right corner of the main display, still green, still running at 40% capacity, plenty of headroom remaining. "We haven't shown them the expensive toys yet." Anand looked at him. "Are you enjoying this?" she asked, in a tone that suggested she wasn't sure whether to be concerned or delighted. Tarek considered the question honestly. "Edmund Cray was right," he said. "That's what I'm enjoying. 300 years later, and that man was right about everything." He picked up his coffee, which had gone cold, and drank it anyway. The emergency session of the Galactic Conclave convened 41 hours into the right of territorial claim, which was, according to the Conclave's own historical records, the first time in 4,000 years that a right session had been suspended mid-engagement due to circumstances on the designated battleground world. The official reason listed in the session request was anomalous engagement conditions, which was one way to put it. The conclave chamber was a structure of extraordinary scale, a space station in permanent orbit above the conclave's administrative world, its main assembly hall large enough to seat 6,000 representatives from 400 civilizations, the air maintained at a composite atmospheric setting that was technically survivable for most known species simultaneously, though not entirely comfortable for any of them. Ambassador Sarah Malone arrived without a delegation. She arrived with her notebook. She took her seat at the designated Earth representative position, a position that had technically existed in the chamber for 200 years, allocated under the Conclave's prospective membership program for monitored pre-emergent worlds, and never once occupied by an actual human being, because no human being had ever been invited to use it. Malone sat down, opened her notebook, and looked around the chamber with the calm, observant attention of someone who had been mentally walking around in this room for a very long time. The Velhari session chair called the assembly to order. It noted, with what might have been diplomatic understatement, that the right of territorial claim currently in progress on Earth had produced engagement outcomes outside established parameters, and that the Vreth Dominion had submitted a formal request for proceedings review. The Vreth Dominion's ambassador, a senior diplomat named Veth Karas, related by blood to the fleet commander currently struggling on the ground below, stood and delivered a 40-minute presentation arguing that Earth's defenses constituted an illegal prepositioning of military assets in violation of conclave territorial designation protocols, which required that a selected battleground world must be in a state of natural pre-engagement condition at the time of right commencement. It was, by conclave standards, a strong argument. When Veth Karas sat down, every eye in the chamber, 6,000 representatives, 6,000 species, 6,000 worldviews, turned to the woman sitting alone at the Earth position with a small leather notebook. Malone stood. She spoke for 2 hours. She did not shout. She did not perform outrage or grief. She spoke with the measured, even delivery of someone presenting evidence in a courtroom where the verdict had not yet been decided, where every word carried weight. She began with Edmund Cray. She told them about the tavern in Edinburgh in 1753. She told them about 8 people sitting around a fire, doing the math that nobody with the power to act on it had been willing to do. She told them about the oath, and the generations, and the patient, invisible, civilization-scale project that had followed. She distributed through the conclave's own translation and distribution systems, delivered simultaneously to every representative terminal, a document archive. 300 years of vigil records, organized chronologically, translated into 40 conclave languages by human linguists who had spent their careers doing exactly this work. Signal intercepts from the 1800s. Lattice engineering specifications dating to 1891. Fabrication facility manifests. Training records. Budget allocations buried inside national infrastructure projects across every nation on Earth. The archive was 700,000 pages long. She gave them 10 minutes to absorb the scope of it. Then she continued. She explained that the vigil had not been a military buildup in the conventional sense. It had been a species survival response to an existential threat assessment that had, as of 41 hours ago, proven entirely correct. She cited the conclave's own founding charter, Chapter 1, Article 1, the preamble that every conclave school taught to every civilization that achieved membership. Every sapient species possesses an inherent right to existence, self-determination, and the preservation of its homeworld. She let that sit for a moment. Then she explained what humanity had built, not as a boast, as evidence. She walked through the lattice architecture, the weapons systems, the vigil's force structure, the Hearthstone command infrastructure. She was specific, technical, and thorough. She described capabilities that were currently operational. She also described capabilities that had not yet been used. The chamber was very quiet. She described the orbital defense platforms hidden in near-Earth asteroid debris fields. She described the deep space monitoring network that had been tracking conclave movement patterns for 60 years. She described the secondary fabrication systems on the Moon and Mars and what they were currently producing. She described Protocol Terminus, a contingency that she sincerely hoped never needed discussion, but which existed, was functional, and was now formally entered into the public conclave record. She closed her notebook. She looked around the chamber. The Vreth Dominion argues that Earth was not in a natural pre-engagement condition, she said. This is accurate. Earth has not been in a natural pre-engagement condition since 1753. We chose not to be, because we understood what natural pre-engagement condition meant for a world that the galaxy's great powers had decided was theirs to use. She paused. We were right, she said simply, and we are still here. She sat down. The chamber did not explode into debate the way chambers usually do after a significant address. It went, for nearly a minute, completely silent. The Vreth Dominion's ambassador was looking at the 700,000-page archive on his terminal. The Kale Ascendancy's representative, who had, as predicted, left the room an hour earlier to make a private call, and had now returned with a slightly different posture, was looking at Malone with an expression that Isfaroth, watching on a relay feed from the outer system, would later describe in her official report as the specific look of someone recalculating a threat assessment in real time. The Velhari session chair cleared its throat. The chair, it said carefully, will allow a 30-minute recess. The 30-minute recess lasted 9 hours. During those 9 hours, several things happened simultaneously in different parts of the galaxy. In the Sol system, Vethorin received a private communication from Vreth High Command ordering him to stabilize all ground positions and make no further offensive advances pending conclave proceedings. He complied without question, because he was a professional, and because his current ground positions were already effectively stabilized in the most unwelcome sense of the word. He hadn't been able to advance meaningfully in 2 days, and he knew it. In the outer system, Isfaroth completed her revised Earth assessment. It was now 612 pages long. She submitted it to Kale High Command with a personal note that read, "We have made an error in our strategic assessment of Saul. I recommend we do not compound the error." In the Conclave Chamber's private negotiation corridors, the Vreth Dominion's legal team worked through the night searching for the specific language they needed in 4,000 years of Conclave procedural law. They found it on page 847 of the Right Engagement Framework, in a clause that had been written into the original charter as a diplomatic courtesy, a way for Tier 1 powers to withdraw from a right engagement that had become strategically disadvantageous without formally acknowledging defeat. The clause was called the Sovereign Withdrawal Provision. It allowed either engaging party to invoke a formal cessation and attribute it to changed strategic circumstances, rather than military failure. It had been used 4 times in 4,000 years. Every previous use had been between 2 Tier 1 powers when one decided the cost of the right had exceeded the value of the contested territory. It had never been invoked because of resistance from the designated battleground world. But technically, the clause did not specify. The Vreth Dominion invoked the Sovereign Withdrawal Provision at 300 Conclave Standard Time, citing changed strategic circumstances. The paperwork was filed correctly, the fees were paid, and the clerk who processed it noted, in the margin of the filing, that this was the most historically unusual invocation of the clause he had encountered in 30 years of conclave administrative work. The Kale Ascendancy, meanwhile, filed a notification under a different provision entirely, the Non-Commencement Declaration, available to any party that had been designated as a right participant but had not yet formally entered engagement. It was, in practical terms, a statement that they were leaving without having officially started. By 600, both parties had withdrawn. The right of territorial claim on Earth had, by the formal record, ended without a victor. The conclave session reconvened. The chair announced the withdrawals and declared the right formally suspended. Malone was already standing. "Ambassador," the chair said carefully, clearly anticipating that whatever she was about to say was going to be complicated, "the floor has not recognized." "I invoke Article 9, Clause 4, Malone said. "Silence." Article 9, Clause 4 of the Galactic Conclave Charter had been written 4,000 years ago by a coalition of civilizations trying to protect smaller member worlds from being perpetually used as right grounds. It read, "Any planetary civilization demonstrating the capacity to defend its homeworld against concurrent Tier 1 military engagement shall be deemed eligible for full conclave membership and mutual defense recognition, retroactive to the date of demonstrated capacity." It had never been used, not once, because no pre-emergent world had ever done what Earth had just done. The chair looked at Malone. It looked at the Vreth Dominion's ambassador. It looked at the Kale Ascendancy's representative. Both of them were very carefully not making eye contact with anyone. "Article 9, Clause 4, the chair said slowly, "requires a verification review by the Standards Committee before." "The evidence is already in the record," Malone said. She held up her notebook. 700,000 pages of it, plus the last 48 hours of engagement data from your own observation satellites. She sat down. The chair looked at the Standards Committee bench, where 7 senior conclave jurists had been sitting in increasingly uncomfortable silence for the last 60 seconds. The lead jurist, an ancient, four-armed being called an Orthari who had been on the committee for longer than most of the represented civilizations had been spacefaring, looked at the chair, then at Malone, then down at the archive on his terminal. He looked up. "The evidence," he said slowly, in a voice that carried the specific tone of someone who had seen a lot of history and was watching more of it happen right now, "appears sufficient for preliminary recognition. The vote took 6 days. Not because the outcome was genuinely uncertain, The evidence record was unambiguous, but because 6,000 civilizations in the conclave had opinions, histories, interests, alliances, and anxieties, and all of those things needed processing time. There were procedural challenges from 7 member species. There were emergency consultations between galactic blocks that had not spoken directly in decades. There were quiet, urgent conversations in hallways and private channels, and encrypted diplomatic frequencies. Civilizations calling each other in the middle of their night cycles with one recurring question. Did you know? The answer from every intelligence service in every member civilization was the same. No. They had watched Earth for decades. Some had watched for a century. Nobody had known. The vigil had been genuinely invisible to everyone who had been looking for 300 years, and that fact, perhaps even more than the lattice or the weapons or the fighter craft, was what made the conversations urgent. Because if humanity had hidden something that large for that long from that many watchers, what did that mean? It meant different things to different species. To the smaller civilizations, the ones who had always been nervous about their own designation on the conclave's power maps, it meant something very close to hope. There was a species that had decided to solve the problem, that had refused the options of submission or annihilation and built a third option from scratch over centuries. If humanity could do it, if that was possible. To the larger powers, the established Tier 1s and Tier 2s, it meant a recalculation. A significant, uncomfortable, urgent recalculation. The vote passed 3,847 to 1,204, with 949 abstentions. Earth was a full member of the Galactic Conclave. The conditions were, as Malone had told the chamber they would be, unconditional. There was no probationary period, no weapons limitation agreement, no requirement to share the vigil's technology or architecture with conclave monitoring bodies, no oversight provisions. Full membership, with all the mutual defense guarantees that entailed, backdated to the moment Earth had demonstrated defensive capacity, which the Standards Committee had dated, after review, to the first successful lattice activation under Vreth orbital bombardment. Tariq received the vote result in the Hearthstone Command Center. He read it twice. Then he stood up, walked to the display wall that had shown him 48 hours of continental engagement feeds, and pressed the button that returned it to its default state, a simple map of Earth, all green, all intact, all present. He stood there for a long time. Anand found him there an hour later. "We won," she said. "Edmund Cray won," Tariq said. He began the formal process of standing down Hearthstone's active status the next morning. Not decommissioning, standing down. The chamber stayed sealed but maintained. The lattice stayed warm. The platforms in the asteroid field stayed powered, their targeting systems running on low-cycle watchkeeping. The fabrication facilities went back to low standby. The vigil formally dissolved 3 weeks later in a private ceremony attended by its senior leadership, 12 people, meeting for the last time in the Edinburgh Tavern room that had been preserved, quietly, for 270 years. There were no speeches. One of them opened a bottle of Scotch whiskey. They drank it. Someone said Cray's name. They went home. The vigil's complete archives were transferred to the newly established Earth Strategic Command, which operated out of a building in Geneva that was not underground. It had windows. Tariq thought this was important, that the work be visible now, that the secrecy that had been a necessity become transparency now that it could. Earth's strength was no longer a secret to protect. It was a fact to project. Malone delivered Earth's first formal address to the full conclave 3 months after membership was confirmed. She had been offered a speechwriter. She declined. She had been offered a prepared text by the United Earth Council's diplomatic corps, assembled by 30 people over 2 weeks. She thanked them and wrote her own. She stood at the podium of the conclave chamber. 6,000 species, 400 civilizations, 4,000 years of accumulated galactic civilization looking at a human being at a podium for the first time. She said 17 words. "We have been watching, we have been waiting, we are ready, choose peace." She stepped away from the podium. The chamber did not applaud. Applause was a human convention, and most species present did not have hands arranged to produce it, and the conclave had no established custom for responding to short addresses. There was a silence that lasted nearly 20 seconds. Then the Orthari, the ancient, four-armed jurist who had been on the standards committee longer than anyone, made a gesture with all four hands simultaneously that his species used to indicate a thing that is true and cannot be argued with. That was the whole address. Across the galaxy, in the weeks and months that followed, 100 civilizations quietly reached out to Earth's new diplomatic offices with a similar question phrased different ways. How did you do it? How do we do it? Can we learn from you? Would you tell us? And 100 more civilizations, the larger ones, the older ones, the ones with names in the galactic record going back millennia, had a different set of conversations. Quieter, more private, spoken only between heads of state and intelligence chiefs and the keepers of old files. If we had been chosen as Earth was chosen, before we were ready, what would have happened to us? And underneath that question, unspoken but present, what is this species really? What have we been looking at all this time thinking we understood it? In Edinburgh, in the unremarkable museum that no tourist had ever specifically sought out, the painting of Edmund Cray still hung on the wall. The man at the desk, writing by firelight, with the expression of someone who was afraid and determined and absolutely right. Someone had placed flowers beneath it. Fresh ones that morning. Nobody admitted to leaving them, but they were replaced every week, and they had been, it turned out, since 1753.